Welcome. This is the Course in Miracles Palm Beach Study Group, Thursday, May 13th. We are on page 40, chapter 3, section 3. We have been emphasizing perception and have said very little about knowledge as yet. This is because perception must be strengthened. It must be straightened out before you can know anything. To know is to be certain. Uncertainty means that you do not know. Knowledge is power because it is certain, and certainty is strength. Perception is temporary. As an attitude of the belief in space and time, it is subject to either fear or love. I'll repeat that. As an attribute of the belief in space and time, it is subject to either fear or love. Misperceptions produce fear, and true perceptions foster love. But neither brings certainty because all perception varies. That is why it is not knowledge. True perception is the basis for knowledge, but knowing is the affirmation of truth and beyond all perceptions. Any questions? Okay, it's pretty straightforward then. All your difficulties stem from the fact that you do not recognize yourself, your brother, or God. To recognize means to know again, implying that you knew before. You can see in many ways because perception involves interpretation, and this means that it is not whole or constant. Excuse me. I'll start that paragraph again. All your difficulties stem from the fact that you do not recognize yourself, your brother, or God. To recognize means to know again, implying that you knew before. You can see in many ways because perception involves interpretation, and this means that it is not whole or consistent. The miracle, being a way of perceiving, is not knowledge. It is the right answer to a question, but you do not question when you know. Questioning illusions is the first step in undoing them. The miracle, or the right answer, corrects them. Since perceptions change, their dependence on time is obvious. How you perceive at any given time determines what you do, and actions must occur in time. Knowledge is timeless because certainty is not questionable. You know when you have ceased to ask questions. Any comments, questions? Well, if there are no questions, then you all must know.
I have one.
Oh, okay.
Um, I don't know that I could ever figure out when I know.
Ah,
I don't know when to stop asking questions. I wouldn't know when that is. I can't understand how I would know when that is.
well, you just answered your own question. You'll know when you stop asking questions.
Oh, okay. All right.
It's kind of like, it's a conundrum, right?
My favorite wine.
But let's put things in perspective here, though. I mean, we are talking about esoteric thing here. It starts out by saying that our difficulties stem from the fact that we do not recognize ourselves, our brothers, or God. And so when you're looking with ego eyes, then you're seeing individual people and you're making judgments about them, and you're seeing them as outside of yourself. You're seeing God as up in the clouds, up in heaven, somewhere other than where you are. But when you get to the point where you realize that God is within you, as Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is within you, and you recognize that you and your brothers and sisters are all the same being, there's only one of us, and that we are spiritual beings, whole and innocent. So when we recognize who we really are, who our brothers are, and who God is, then those questions aren't asked anymore, because then you know. It becomes a reality for you. You don't question, who am I? What's my purpose in life? Why am I on this earth? All these things that people strive to or struggle with through their lives. And then it says to recognize means to know again. You recognize, you know again, implying that you knew before, which we did. We knew all of this before we created the ego world that we find ourselves living in. And so, all of the questions that we have now in the ego world are pointing us towards knowing the truth. They're not questions about how do you cook spaghetti, okay? They're questions about, the reality of reality. They're spiritual questions.
Yeah.
And, okay. Do you have more to say, Eileen?
No, I was saying, okay, thank you. But then you were going to say something else, so I don't want to interrupt.
Oh, well, I was just going to sentence 8. Since perceptions change, their dependences on time is obvious. So time is a construct of the ego. From Spirit's point of view, there is no time. From Spirit's point of view, we are already enlightened. We are already awakened from the dream. But in ego's perception, time goes by. And so that's what we're living in right now. And so we're dependent on time to bring us to the place where we cease to have any more questions. Okay, paragraph 3. The questioning mind perceives itself in time and therefore looks for future answers. The closed mind believes the future and the present will be the same. This establishes a seemingly stable state that is usually an attempt to counteract an underlying fear that the future will be worse than the present. This fear inhibits the tendency to question at all. And we've seen plenty of examples of this throughout history where people, condemned Galileo and Copernicus because they were saying that something completely radically different from what they assumed was true and the fact, and what they knew. And people have always resisted change. People have always gone the route of believing the way they were taught to believe and not to question, and this is what mother taught me, and so it must be true. And that's it. There's no need to question any further. But others of us have inquiring minds that want to know. Paragraph 4. True vision is the natural perception of spiritual sight, but it is still a correction rather than a fact. Why? Because it's a perception. The spiritual sight is symbolic and therefore not a device for knowing. It is, however, a means of right perception, which brings it into the proper domain of the miracle. So you see there's steps that we have to take along the way to get to the goal. So a vision of God would be a miracle rather than a revelation. The fact that perception is involved at all removes the experience from the realm of knowledge. That is why visions, however holy, do not last. The Bible tells you to know yourself, paragraph 5, or to be certain. Certainty is always of God. When you love someone, you have perceived him as he is, and this makes it possible for you to know him. Until you first perceive him as he is, you cannot know him. While you ask questions about him, you are clearly implying that you do not know God. Certainty does not require action. When you say you are acting on the basis of knowledge, you are really confusing knowledge with perception. Knowledge provides the strength for creative thinking, but not for right doing. Perception, miracles, and doing are closely related. Knowledge is the result of revelation and induces only thought. Even in its most spiritualized form, perception involves the body. Knowledge comes from the altar within and is timeless because it is certain. To perceive the truth is not the same as to know it. Questions? Comments? Well, I think I'll go over it again. So again, as we do all of the time here, we break it down into ego and spirit. So the Bible tells you to know yourself to be certain. That's spirit talking. Certainty is always of God. So certainty is true spirit, true knowing. When you love someone, you have perceived him as he is. That's spiritual love. And this makes it possible for you to know him, to spiritually know him. Until you first perceive him as he is, you cannot know him. Until you see him as a spiritual being, you'll never know him as a spiritual being. That's the same as saying, until you perceive yourself as a spiritual being, you'll never know yourself as a spiritual being. So while you ask questions about him, you are clearly implying that you do not know him. Because if you're questioning who he is, if you're questioning who you are, then obviously you don't know who he is. You don't know who you are. You're not seeing him as a spiritual being. You're not seeing yourself as a spiritual being if there's a question involved about who am I? Certainty does not require action. Certainty is truth. Certainty is spirit. Spirit doesn't require any action because it knows, it is. The very most basic fundamental truth is this. It's two words. God is. That's it. God is. That's the most fundamental truth. Certainty does not require action. When you say you're acting on the basis of knowledge, you're really confusing knowledge with perception. You know, I'm sure I can fly because if I just flap my wings hard enough, like the bird does, I'm sure I'll go up in the air. I don't know where that came from, but as an illustration of, you know, sometimes our perceptions are not very, very good. But anyway, but we think we know. We think we know, but it's not really true knowledge. It's because we're confusing it with our perception of things. That's just like, well, okay, a better example going back to Galileo and Copernicus, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. So obviously the sun is going around the earth. The earth's in the center, and obviously the sun's moving around the earth because I know that the sun comes up in the east and it goes down in the west. And I know that it happens every day. So that's the way it is. But that's just our perception until we finally realize that that was a perception that was not correct. And so that knowledge was not correct either. So Sentence 8, knowledge provides the strength for creative thinking, but not for right doing. For right doing means spiritual doing. Perceptions, miracles, and doing are closely related. Knowledge is the result of revelation and induces only thought. Even in its most spiritualized form, perception involves the body because we're using our senses, or sight and smell and hearing, what have you. That's how we gain the knowledge. So this is a spiritual activity that we're engaged in now, but it still involves our body. We're reading, we're listening, we're speaking, we're throwing thoughts back and forth. So although knowledge is the result of revelation, which this book is a result of revelation, and it induces thought, but even in its most spiritualized form, it still involves the bodily perceptions. But knowledge, which is spirit, comes from the altar within and is timeless because it is certain. God is. There's nothing else. To perceive the truth is not the same to know it. You may perceive that truth that God is, but until you know it, that's when it becomes real to you. So all perception is ego. All knowing, true knowing, is spirit. Any questions or comments now? Paragraph 6. Right perception is necessary before God can communicate directly to his altars, which he established in his sons. There he can communicate his certainty, and his knowledge will bring peace without question. God is not a stranger to his sons, and his sons are not strangers to each other. Knowledge preceded both perception and time, and will ultimately replace them. That is the real meaning of Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, and before Abraham was, I am. Perception can and must be stabilized, but knowledge is stable. Fear God and keep his commandments becomes know God and accept his certainty. So there's another place where the Course is correcting a Bible statement. Fear God and keep his commandments becomes know God and accept his certainty. So right perception, remember, perception's ego, but in the ego, we can rightly perceive, which is what we're doing here now in studying A Course in Miracles. We are rightly perceiving if we are understanding what it is teaching us. And that is necessary before God can communicate directly to his altars, which is, within us, which he established in his sons. So again, you have to take steps. We have to walk out of the ego into the spirit, but that path means walking through the ego. So while we're doing that, we're still to one degree or another in ego, but hopefully with each step we take, we're less and less in ego and more in spirit until we can walk over the threshold. Does that make sense? Are there any questions? So we have to walk through perception to get into knowledge, into true knowledge. 7, if you attack error in another, you will hurt yourself. You cannot know your brother when you attack him. Attack is always made upon a stranger. You are making him a stranger by misperceiving him, and so you cannot know him. It is because you have made him a stranger that you are afraid of him. Perceive him correctly so that you can know him. There are no strangers in God's creation. To create as he created, you can create only what you know, and therefore accept as yours. God knows his children with perfect certainty. He created them by knowing them. He recognizes them perfectly. When they do not recognize each other, they do not recognize him, because there's only one of us. Yes, Helene.
I'm thinking about Israel and what's happening tonight in Gaza. I mean, all wars, really, right? I mean,
Yes,
if we were to take the last paragraph that you just read literally to heart, each and every one of us, there would be no war. There
that's
couldn't be.
correct. Yeah,
Troubling. I did want to back up just a little bit though, John. There was one sentence I didn't quite understand and I didn't ask you before you moved on. The sentence in paragraph 6 that says, oh, I thought it was here, and now I'm going to not find it real quickly. The one that says that okay, it's actually the end of paragraph 5. Sentence 9, perception, miracles, and doing are closely related. So perceptions being ego, how could that be closely related to miracles? Which I thought was spirit, right? And I'm not sure what they mean by doing. I don't think that paragraph explains that sentence much.
okay. Well, like I was saying before, we have to walk through ego to get to spirit. So when we start perceiving the spirit while we're still in ego, and we can work our way into miracle of understanding who we truly are and working out of love and forgiveness, and then doing that, acting in such a way that we're putting that in practice, to putting that truth into practice while still in the ego world. And in that way, they're closely related because they're taking us on that path, on that journey.
Oh, okay. So not closely related as to characteristics necessarily or
It's
what they
kind of,
mean to us, just that you have to walk through all three and they're near each other in terms of your progress.
Yeah, remember, it's talking about the timeline.
Okay.
Remember, it was talking about time? Because if you go to paragraph 4, until you first perceive him as he is, you cannot know him. See? So you have
Okay.
to perceive people as spiritual beings. And then that brings you to working the miracle of forgiveness and acceptance. And then that brings you into your doing of living your life in that way, which then will ultimately bring you to enlightenment.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything, Eileen? Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about, think faith or belief. Is faith and belief ego, or is that knowing?
No, the definition of belief is accepting something is true even though you can't prove it. When people say, I believe in God, they're saying that they accept God as a reality, but they can't prove it. Knowing is saying, I don't need to have faith. It's not something I believe. It's something I know. It is truth because I know it to be truth. There's no question in my mind. Does that answer? Or do you want more?
Well, I guess when I think about my super religious friends, they would tell you that they know that God is. They wouldn't require proof to know that God is, and yet they use the word faith a lot. So maybe it's semantics and maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah, a lot of it is semantics, and again, it depends on your perception, on your point of view. If somebody tells me that they know that there is a God, I'd say, good for you. They may not, their knowing of God may not be the same as my knowing of God, but because some people say they know God and yet they'll still attack their brother. So, it's like when they asked Jesus about how you can tell, and Jesus said, "Ye shall know them by their fruit." You know, if the apple is sweet and juicy and ripe, but if it's rotten, ye shall know them by their fruit. Not only that, but it's like, oh, there's a tree there, but we don't really know what it is. Well, when it produces apples, then you know it's an apple tree. You shall know them by their fruit. In other words, by their deeds, what they do, what they produce. So
Yeah. I mean, that sounds, sort of like perfection. Do you think that you could be certain about, that God is, and still not behave perfectly?
Of course.
I think
While,
that happens a lot.
while we're still in the ego, we're subjected to that possibility, you know. I mean, that's the thing. We've got to keep walking until we reach the door and the end of the journey. There's always the possibility that you'll slip and fall, you know. So that's just part of the journey, though.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, and if you do slip and fall, well, hopefully that's a lesson and you learn from it, and you can pick yourself up and continue along your way. But you know, while you're in the ego, nobody's going to be perfect. Perfection is something we can strive for, and we can reach it. Though that's one of the benefits of studying A Course in Miracles is that it's telling us that we can reach that perfection. Though, you know, that many times in ego teachings they'll say, well, we can strive for perfection, but nothing's ever perfect and we'll never really reach perfection, no matter how hard you try. And the Course is saying, no, you keep on trying, you'll get there. It is an attainable goal. Others have done it before you. You'll do it, and many more will do it after you. As a matter of fact, everyone will eventually. How are we good? Are we good to go to the next paragraph?
I am.
All right. Error and the ego. Is that where we are? Oh no, wait a minute.
Yeah, John, that was it. I think the last paragraph 7 was the one about you can't attack yourself.
Yeah. So are we on?
We're on error and the ego, like you said.
We are on error and the ego. Okay,
Yes.
good. So paragraph 1 of error and the ego. The abilities you now possess are only shadows of your real strength. All of your present functions are divided and open to question and doubt. This is because you are not certain how you will use them and are therefore incapable of knowledge. You are also incapable of knowledge because you can still perceive lovelessly. Perception did not exist until the separation introduced degrees, aspects, and intervals. Spirit has no levels, and all conflict arises from the concept of levels. Only the levels of the Trinity are capable of unity. The levels created by the separation cannot but conflict. This is because they are meaningless to each other. Consensus, the level of perception, was the first split introduced into the mind after the separation, making the mind a perceiver rather than a creator. Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. The ego is a wrong-minded attempt to perceive yourself as you wish to be rather than as you are. Yet you can know yourself only as you are, because that is all you can be sure of. Everything else is open to question. The ego is the questioning aspect of the post-separation self, which was made rather than created. It is capable of asking questions, but not of perceiving meaningful answers, because these would involve knowledge and cannot be perceived. The mind is therefore confused, because only one-mindedness can be without confusion. A separated or divided mind must be confused. It is necessarily uncertain about what it is. It has to be in conflict because it is out of accord with itself. This makes its aspects strangers to each other, and this is the essence of the fear-prone condition, in which attack is always possible. You have every reason to feel afraid as you perceive yourself. This is why you cannot escape from fear until you realize that you did not and could not create yourself. You can never make your misperceptions true, and your creation is beyond your own error. That is why you must eventually choose to heal the separation. Questions? Eileen?
I'm not sure I quite followed all of that. I think of consciousness differently, I guess. I thought consciousness was a more spiritual, like a mindfulness. I'm not sure I really followed all of this.
Well, in effect, it's defining consciousness as the level of perception. So in our mind, we're conscious. Everybody's conscious. Everybody has consciousness if they're alive.
You mean
So,
basic consciousness, okay.
so if you're the most spiritual being on the planet or the least spiritual person on the planet, you have consciousness. See? So consciousness, the level of perception, was the first split introduced into the mind after separation, making the mind, in splitting it in two between perception and knowing, between ego and God. But everybody's conscious. So consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. That's what paragraph 2, sentence 2 is teaching us. Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. So it is giving us that definition. Now, we have a term for the higher consciousness or the spiritual consciousness, which is trying to give us a term for spiritual understanding. But just consciousness on its own is the domain of the ego. You have to get to a higher consciousness, into the spirit mind, to be spiritually conscious. Again, semantics, definitions, it can be confusing. And that's why the Course is trying to unconfuse it for us. But some people get very confused in trying to understand what it's saying.
Yeah, but I get it. I mean, you just basic consciousness helps explain it. I was thinking more of higher consciousness,
Right,
but basic consciousness is, like you said, there's nothing to it.
right.
It's just basically just existing, basic consciousness. So I got it. I understand now how that is being just used here.
Good. Somebody tell me what the last paragraph I read was.
Paragraph 3 is the last one you read. You're on paragraph 4 now.
Thank you so much. Right-mindedness is not to be confused with the knowing mind, because it is applicable only to right perception. See, there again, it's qualifying it again. This is one of the problems with language. As many words as there are in the English language, nonetheless, we have to put qualifiers on certain words to try to get the definition, the understanding. So right-mindedness, spirit-mindedness, is not to be confused with the knowing mind. Now that's confusing me. I thought the knowing mind was spirit mind, because it is applicable only to right perception. Okay, so right-mindedness, they're saying, is right perception in the ego. You can be right-minded or wrong-minded, and even this is subject to degrees, clearly demonstrating that knowledge is not involved. The term right-mindedness is properly used as the correction for wrong-mindedness and applies to the state of mind that induces accurate perception. It is miracle-minded because it heals misperception, and this is indeed a miracle in view of how you perceive yourself. Going through this paragraph is like walking through a minefield. Be careful where you step. Okay, I don't know. Right-mindedness is not to be confused with the knowing mind. Okay, so again, I'm going to say that this whole chapter is talking about walking that path between ego and spirit, and how we do that. So it's trying to break down the steps. It's trying to break down the degrees that we go through to get from the one place to the other. So it says you can be right-minded or wrong-minded, but it's not to be confused with the knowing mind. That's the spirit mind, because it's still in the realm of perception, is the idea. And even this is subject to degrees. So again, it's subject to separation, it's subject to perception, and it's a part of, it's subject to the ego thinking. So clearly demonstrating that knowledge is not involved, because remember earlier it said that knowledge there's no question. With knowledge, there's no question. But if in your right-minded, wrong-minded journey, there are differences, there are degrees, then there are questions. So the term right-mindedness is properly used as the correction for wrong-mindedness. We start out being wrong-minded because of being born in the ego world. But as we journey through into right-mindedness, the right-mindedness starts to correct that wrong-mindedness and applies to the state of mind that induces accurate perception, which is the perception that will lead you to the truth, the perception that will lead you to spirit. And therefore it's miracle-minded because it's healing the misperception. And this is indeed a miracle in view of how you perceive yourself. So when you can use right-mindedness to overcome wrong-mindedness and start to perceive yourself as a spiritual being, then you're on the right path. Then you're indeed on a miracle, in the view of how you perceive yourself. So perception always involves some misuse of mind because it brings the mind into areas of uncertainty. The mind is very active. When it chooses to be separate, it chooses to perceive. Until then, it wills only to know. Afterwards, it can only choose ambiguously, and the only way out of ambiguity is clear perception. The mind returns to its proper function only when it wills to know. This places it in the service of spirit, where perception is changed. The mind chooses to divide itself when it chooses to make its own level. But it could not entirely separate itself from spirit because it is from spirit that it derives its whole power to make or create. Even in miscreation, the mind is affirming its source, or it would merely cease to be. This is impossible because the mind belongs to spirit, which God created, and is therefore eternal. Any questions? The ability to perceive made the body possible, but you must perceive something and with something. That is why perception involves an exchange or translation, which knowledge does not need. The interpretive function of perception, a disordered form of creation, then permits you to interpret the body as yourself in an attempt to escape from the conflict you have induced. Spirit, which knows, could not be reconciled with this loss of power because it is incapable of darkness. This makes spirit most inaccessible to the mind and entirely inaccessible to the body. Therefore, spirit is perceived as a threat, because light abolishes darkness merely by showing you it is not there. Truth will always overcome error in this way. This cannot be an active process of correction because, as I have already emphasized, knowledge does not do anything. It can be perceived as an attacker, but it cannot attack. What you perceive as its attack is your own vague recognition that knowledge can always be remembered, never having been destroyed. So, you know, we really, we put ourselves in this position ourselves. You know, we did it to ourselves. We as the communal oneness of all of humanity, not as individuals, because in reality, there's only one of us. But spirit, this makes spirit almost inaccessible to the mind, but the split that happened, the creation of ego, and entirely inaccessible to the body. But even though a lot of humans look at spirit as a threat, we understand here that spirit cannot attack. And that what we perceive as attack, and that comes up with guilt, you see. It doesn't say that here, but in other places in the course, we will talk about guilt. But believing that you're guilty is the same as believing that God will punish you, is the same as believing that spirit can attack you. But spirit is incapable of attacking. What you perceive as attack is your own vague recognition that knowledge can always be remembered and never having been destroyed. And that brings fear, because that, you know, let's face it, if you're invested in thinking that you're a human being that's inevitably is going to die and go to either heaven or hell, and considering that there are billions, or if not trillions, of sins to commit, that hell is the most likely place that any one of us will probably go to. You have to be a complete saint to get to heaven in some people's minds. And they're constantly afraid that the devil is out to get them and what have you. And, you know, and all of this is just ego thinking that's trying to keep us trapped in the ego. We got one paragraph left. Should we go for it, or do you have any questions? Okay. The last paragraph for this chapter, or this section. God and his creations remain in surety, and therefore know that no miscreation exists. Truth cannot deal with errors that you want. I was a man who remembered spirit and its knowledge. As a man, I did not attempt to counteract error with knowledge, but to correct error from the bottom up. I demonstrated both the powerlessness of the body and the power of the mind. By uniting my will with that of my Creator, I naturally remembered spirit and its real purpose. I cannot unite your will with God's for you, but I can erase all misperceptions from your mind if you will bring it under my guidance. Only your misperceptions stand in your way. Without them, your choice is certain. Sane perception induces sane choosing. I cannot choose for you, but I can help you make your own right choice. Many are called, but few are chosen, should be. All are called, but few chose to listen. Therefore, they do not choose right. The chosen ones are merely those who choose right sooner. Right minds can do this now, and they will find rest unto their souls. God knows you only in peace, and this is your reality. I just want to point out one thing here. I think this is a great paragraph. You should probably copy it and type it up and hang it on the bathroom mirror or on the refrigerator or someplace. Read it over and over again. But especially the part where it says, I cannot unite your will with God's for you, but I can erase all misperceptions from your mind if you will bring it under my guidance. And there are some people who are going to say, oh, well, I pray to Jesus all of the time, but I never get any answer. How is he going to guide me if I can't hear him? Well, the whole Course in Miracles is his words. He's teaching us through this book. If that's not guidance, I don't know what is. I mean, you don't have to be looking for visions and pie in the sky or anything like that. It's right here. It's in black and white. Just read it and try to understand it. And you're being guided by him. Well, all righty. Any other questions, comments before we close for tonight? No? I believe we will begin on page 44 next week. Section 5, Beyond Perception. Beyond Perception. That's where we need to go. All righty, everyone. Thank you for your participation tonight, and let us have a moment of silence.